So welcome to week one of Introduction to American Politics, where we'll be covering the basic concepts of the U.S. government, and in the back half of the week, talking about federalism, the relationship between the national government, state governments, and local governments. And so in this introductory overview of this first week, what I want to do is kind of talk about some of the key concepts, some of the key ideas to give you a kind of grounding as to how I approach the study of American politics as a political scientist. Now, I talked about in the previous introductory video the idea that you can look at politics as a game. And here's where I'm going to kind of lay out how I view politics, particularly American politics, in the idea of a game. So I'm going to give you some details. It will probably be helpful for you to take some notes on this particular short lecture, but I'm going to give you the basics so that you can possibly understand and then perhaps use this idea of a game to understand or better understand American politics. Also want to talk real briefly about how political scientists study power and how we approach the study of politics. Again, something you may want to take some notes about. Then I'll kind of give you some questions, some guiding questions to think about when you're reading particularly chapter 1 on the basic foundational knowledge about government, about politics, and about civic engagement. And then for chapter 3, which is in the back half of the week, about American federalism, I'll also give you some guiding questions to think about that particular chapter. Again, it will be important that some of this information may be on test 1, so it would probably be good to be able to take some notes for you to review before you take the first test. So, with that said, is playing a game like playing politics? All of us have probably played a game at some point in our lives, whether it's chess, whether it's checkers, whether it's baseball, whether it's football, basketball, no matter what. Some of us have played games and know the basic concepts of playing a game. Hopefully everybody has played a game. If you haven't played a game, you need to play a game this summer. But if you think about playing a game, you can then use those ideas to think about politics and in particularly American politics. So playing a game, what are the rules of the game? There are some basic fundamental rules, unless you're playing something like Calvin Ball. If you haven't read any of the Calvin and Hobbes cartoons, I would encourage you to do so. But Calvin Ball is basically Calvin playing a game, and then he makes up the rules in the middle of the game. You know that that's not really fair, but that's part of the rules of playing Calvin Ball. You can play the game any way you want. What also are the goals of the game? How do you win the game? How do you go about approaching winning the game? What is winning the game? Is it scoring more points? Is it getting a lower score than everybody else? Say, for example, in golf. What are the goals? How are you trying to win the game? You also need to understand where the game is being played. Is it on a football field? Is it on a basketball court? Is it on a soccer field? Is it a video game? Where's the game being played? Oftentimes the environment can have an influence on how that game is played. Who are the players? This is probably one of the most important aspects. If you ever play a game or watch a game, I'm a big college football fan. I prefer Clemson University in terms of its football, but you got to understand who the players are. How are they participating in the game? You also have to think about who the referees are. Who are the umpires? How are they managing calling the game? Is it sometimes unfair? Do you think that you're getting a bad call? That's the same approach in terms of any game that you can basically play. What are the strategies for playing the game? We all know in terms of whatever game you're playing, chess, checkers, football, it doesn't matter. what are some strategies that you can use to play the game? So if you think about all these different components, the rules, the goals, the players, the courts, the umpires, what are the strategies? If you can think about all of these ideas, you can indeed think about American politics. And this is the way that I'm going to be approaching the study of American politics and how I usually teach American politics. So, it's all a game. When you think about American politics, you can use this game idea to hopefully better understand and put the pieces together that we're going to be covering over the next several weeks. And the key thing is to always think about things like the rules of the game. Where are we playing the game? Is it at the national level, at the state level, at the local level? What are indeed the rules to this game? We oftentimes say there are rules because we find it in things like the U.S. Constitution, state constitutions. Those are the playbooks by which you can play the game and understand the rules. Those are oftentimes what we call the institutions of government in American politics. Playing the game in Congress, playing the game in the presidency, in the courts, in the states. Those are all the structures of American politics, and they oftentimes shape how the game is played. Another aspect, who are the players in the particular game? Is it political parties? Are there candidates, the voters, interest groups, the media? When it comes to the players of the game, what we say in political science is that's the study of political behavior, or the behavioral aspect to political science. How do people behave? How do they interact? How do they play the game of politics? It's all done through the players in the game. If you think about the goals and the outcomes of the game, that's oftentimes what we as political scientists call policies. What's a policy? Well, it's a decision made by government. And that is oftentimes the outcome of the game. President Biden wants some policies. Congressional Republicans want some policies. Former President Trump chose to do some policies. Those are all the goals and the eventual outcome of the game of politics. And then finally, what are the strategies? What are the objectives of playing this particular game? That's oftentimes what political scientists will call the theory behind politics, political theory. And this is an important component of the way that I approach the game of politics. Because the way that I look at this particular game, it's a game all about one critical aspect. And that is the aspect of power. Now I'm going to go through and show you a kind of circular approach to how I think about this idea of a game in American politics. But the game's objective is all about political power. How do you get it? How do you keep it? And once you have political power, that then leads to the second key component of my approach to thinking about politics, and that is politics. Politics is basically the means of expressing power. I'm going to get more into it and talk a little bit more in detail, but once you start to exercise power, you are playing politics. And once you play politics, those decisions that come out of politics is indeed policy. The decisions, the choices that we make are all policy decisions made because of politics and because of the political power that comes with it. Once you make a choice, once you make a policy decision, that then leads to bias. Bias is basically the idea that one group's going to be favored over another group. When government chooses to act, or sometimes when government chooses not to act, it can favor one group over the other. And guess what happens? That group that gets favored has more power. So in the grand context of things, the way that I think about this game of American politics, it's centered around power, which leads us into politics, which then leads us into policy. It favors one group over another, and that repeats the cycle in terms of power. Now let me talk a little bit about the specifics behind each of these four concepts, because I think it's important for you to kind of ground yourself in some basic ideas and foundations. First off, what is power? For political scientists, in thinking about this idea of power, the way that we tend to approach it is one of two ways. The first is the ability to achieve a desired outcome. If I have power, I want to achieve something with that power. There's something that I want to do. That's an outcome. And if I have power, I'm able to achieve that desired outcome. The second way to think about power is the ability to influence the behavior of others in a matter they may not choose to do. Meaning, I have power if I'm able to get you to do something. So that's the two ways to think about power in this context. Now, certainly there are ways to deliver this power. Three different concepts of power based on those definitions. The first way to think about the concept of power is by making decisions. How do you go about making decisions? If you make a decision, you are exercising power. You made a decision to watch this video. You're exercising your own form of power. Power of knowledge, power of education. The second way to think about power is through setting the agenda. The idea of setting the agenda means if I get to control what you think about in terms of the agenda, then I have power to determine how you think about these things. The third way to think about power as a concept is the idea of controlling the thought. Oftentimes we refer to this in the term propaganda. If I'm using propaganda, what I'm trying to do is to control the way you think about things when it comes to whatever topic I'm exercising thought control over. Oftentimes, studying political science means we are trying to understand this idea of power. Who has it? Who wants it? When do they get it? How do they get it? You'll read in the textbook a very famous quote, and I think it's very appropriate. Politics is who gets what, when, and how. This is the idea of power. Now, power, of course, leads to politics in my little circular approach. And the idea of politics is the notion that you can define politics through being the structures, the behavior, and the theories about how we govern ourselves. In Chapter 1, you're going to hear a lot about governments and about how the way people structure their governments, how they interact with their governments. What are some theories about governments? This is the basic idea of thinking about politics. Now, you can also think about politics as the rules of the game. Here's how you're going to play the game. The game's about power, and we play the game through the rules. That's the politics of the power idea. Now, there are also different notions of politics. Just as we have different concepts or ways to think about power, we can also think about politics in different ways as well. One of the first ways that we oftentimes think about politics is that it's about the government and it's about the state. Now here you'll notice that state is lowercase. If I were to say the state of North Carolina, that would be an uppercase S for state. But when we talk about the state, we're talking about a nation, a country, a group, a geographic region that a group has defined as this is the United States of America, as opposed to Germany or Canada or Australia or China. These are the state forms. And oftentimes we think about politics as being about the government and about the state of our country. But you can also think about politics in other ways. Another way to think about politics is that we're really regulating community affairs. How do we interact with each other? And who makes the rules to determine that regulation of our community's affairs? Another way to think about politics: how do we resolve conflict? We can do it through the bullets. We can shoot each other up. We can blow each other up. That could be a way to resolve our conflicts. And unfortunately, the United States has had that with the Civil War. But in general, politics is about resolving conflicts through the ballot box, through voting, through elections, through getting our representatives elected to political office. The final way to think about politics is managing resources. How are we going to deal with all the issues, and how and which issues will be dealt with by our government or left up to the private marketplace through capitalism? These are all different ways to think about politics. Politics is going to lead us then to policy. And the way to think about defining policy is that it's a course of action or inaction. Policy can be a course of action or inaction that an individual, a group, a business, or even a government can choose to do. Basically, when I think about policy, I think about the fact government's chosen to do something. National defense, protecting the environment, building highways, airports, those kinds of things. But if government chooses not to do something, that's a decision and that's a policy as well. And there are different ways, just as with power and with politics, there are different ways to think and understand this notion of policy. One is, what are the intentions in terms of government's decision to do something or to not do something? What does government say it is going to do oftentimes? That's the intentions behind the policy. Another way to think about public policy is, what are the actions that government is choosing to do? How does government behave regarding this particular issue? Or what does government actually do in comparison to what it intended to do? Different ways to think about policy. The third way is through results. What are the consequences of government's actions and the impact on our local communities, on our states, on our country as a whole? Those are all the key things when it comes to policy decisions that government chooses to do or chooses not to do. Once you've made a choice, once you actually do something, you are then typically favoring one group over another. And that's the classic definition of bias. Who gets favored in a government decision and who doesn't. And oftentimes those who benefit from a particular government decision are what we would call biased over those who are not favored. Whoever chooses or whoever gets the government action or activities are biased. They are favored over those who choose not to get it. Therefore, bias gives the favored groups more power. That was my son doing something upstairs. My apologies. But in terms of the bias, the favored groups get more power, and then the cycle tends to repeat itself. So again, kind of putting all this together, this idea of politics is a game, and the game about power. I hope you'll think about this throughout the semester and think about the players, the rules, the structures, the fields, the courts, the umpires, the outcomes, the strategies, how all this fits together through power leading to politics, leading to policy, leading to bias, and then back to power is the way that I think about American politics, and hopefully it'll be helpful to you as well. Now, as a political scientist, we have a very formalized way to think about this power in this idea of politics, because what we are doing is we are studying society. And those of us who study society are called social scientists. This is part of the social sciences. At Catawba, you will often hear it perhaps referred to as social and behavioral sciences. And what we're ultimately trying to do is to understand and to investigate human behavior. How do humans organize themselves? How do they approach creating a society? Now, there are other social science disciplines. For those of you in the business department, one of the areas you probably will take is economics. That's a social science. That's an approach to studying how humans behave, how they interact, how they deal with things on economic issues. If you're a psychology major, you're studying human behavior psychologically. If you're a sociology major, you're focused on what are the different components of society that make up the social sciences and society. All of us who study the social sciences utilize what we call the scientific method. Now, if you're in biology or chemistry or physics or environmental studies, you will know something about the scientific method. But we as social scientists also use the scientific method. And this is a pretty important component that I'm going to go over very briefly, but the various stages of the scientific method is how we investigate politics and ultimately power. We start off by thinking about a theory. What's a general idea of what we believe structures human behavior? For those of us who are political scientists, we are thinking about how do we structure government? How do we structure the fundamental approaches to governing society? So we have these big ideas, these theories. This is what we think human beings do when they structure government. And taking those theories, we want to kind of investigate how humans behave, how they interact. So we're going to come up with educated guesses. That is what's called hypotheses. Something that we think we see in this theory, but we want to try and investigate and understand it more broadly so that we can confirm the theory or say, you know what, the theory doesn't work. We got to come up with a new theory. All of this comes out of the work done with hypotheses. And in order to prove a hypothesis, we have to have data. We have to collect information. Just as if the biology and chemistry professors are collecting samples, we collect data as social scientists. And once we have that data, we can perform analysis, oftentimes through the power of statistics and math. Once we have that analysis, we have to interpret it. What does this tell us about human behavior? What do we now understand about what humans are doing when they act politically? And then finally, we have to make conclusions. Does it support the theory that we thought about? Or does it change the theory? Do we have to go with another approach? This is the scientific method that we as political scientists make. Now, oftentimes political scientists will study a lot of these common ideas, but in more specific approaches. For example, there are some of us that study the institutions of government. There are folks that study Congress. There are others who study the presidency, the courts. Those are ways that we try to understand how humans act politically. We can also look at how people behave politically. Why do certain people vote and others don't? How do people vote? What drives their vote? How do people get engaged in interest groups? How does the media influence the way we look at politics? Those are all questions that we want to get answered, and that's part of political behavior. There are some political scientists that study political theories. Why do people structure the way they structure governments? Is human nature good? Are human beings good, or are they evil? Those are some of the key questions posed there. And then finally, why does government choose to do some things and choose not to do some things? Those are the policy questions that are oftentimes studied. Now, for me, I'm an American political scientist, not just because I'm a citizen of the United States, but I study U.S. politics. So I'm an Americanist. I study American politics. The other political science professor on Catawba's campus is Dr. Norris Feeney. He teaches mostly about international politics or comparative politics. That's the study of everybody else besides the United States. So if you think about political science, it's basically those of us who study American politics, those of us who study everybody else. And the two can intermesh with each other. So some questions to consider as you're thinking about Chapter 1 and the government and politics idea. Now, these are also posted on the website in Blackboard, but some things to think about as you're reading through Chapter 1. You want to think about what is government, what are the different types of governments, and what are the characteristics of governments? How are they structured? Why are they structured? What are some basic principles of governments? And then the next question to think about is, what is politics? Now, the book will take a very different approach to thinking about politics from me. But again, think about their definition, their ideas of politics, and what are the characteristics. They will also focus on two core ideas in American politics: elitism versus pluralism. And you want to think about what defines each of those. What are the principles of civic engagement in a democracy? And what do we know about Americans participating in our politics through civic engagement? And then ultimately be thinking about all this time, how does this information help explain the game of politics? You can buy my theory, you can discount it. But in your personal journals, what I want you to be thinking about is, how would you explain and understand the idea of American politics? I think it's helpful to do it through a game analogy. For question on Chapter 3, and again, these will be posted in Blackboard, what you want to be thinking about is American federalism, and specifically in terms of the ideas about the different levels of government vertically and how they've been divided in terms of power. If you take this notion of power and apply it to American politics, you can think of American politics being divided vertically, top to bottom, in terms of how power is distributed. What do we know about American federalism in this division of vertical power? How has federalism changed and evolved over time? What is today's view of federalism? Another key question, how do the three levels of government, national, state, and local, work with each other or potentially work against each other? And then also think about what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages to having a federal system and using federalism to structure a government system. And probably most importantly, you can think of it again, how does federalism potentially influence the way you think about the game of politics? So again, this first week, we're going through some very basic concepts: government, politics, civic education, engagement, and American federalism. But all of these ideas are kind of the building blocks of what you should be thinking about when it comes to American politics. Let me know if you have any questions throughout the process. I'll be happy to help answer anything. Good luck with this first week.